We've got 3 presenters today, and I'm just going to go through individual introductions for each of them, and then I'll pass the microphone over. Our first presenter today is Brian Bedford. Brian is the Acting Director for the Infrastructure and Engineering Branch in the Ministry of Community, Sport and Cultural Development. Brian is responsible for providing guidance and feedback through all infrastructure funding, from project applications and reviews through contract administration. His focus is on sustainable infrastructure planning. He's also responsible for planning, development, evaluation, and facilitating implementation of initiatives designed to improve the long-term sustainability of local government infrastructure. And he's also a participant in Asset Management BC. Our second presenter is Pat Gordon. Pat is the Sustainable Cities International Network Director. Pat has over 20 years' experience in the not-for-profit and municipal, provincial, and federal government sectors in Canada and Great Britain. Pat has been at the forefront of long-range urban planning with the City of Calgary. She managed the Imagine Calgary project, Calgary's long-range urban sustainability plan, with over 18,000 citizens engaged in the process. Building on Imagine Calgary, Pat then led the Planet Calgary project, which has resulted in a sustainable integrated land use and transportation plan for the city. Our third presenter is Eric Mcnaughton. Eric is the Acting Manager for Transportation Strategy at the City of Calgary. He's responsible for developing long-range strategies, policies, and business plans to support the implementation of the Calgary Transportation Plan and Municipal Development Plan. Prior to joining Transportation Strategy, Eric worked as the team lead for the Calgary Transportation Plan as part of the multidisciplinary Planet Calgary process to create a new, more sustainable vision for Calgary. So we'll be moving through the agenda for the day, starting with Brian, and he'll be talking about aging infrastructure and asset management, and then we'll move on to Pat, who will discuss urban form and infrastructure costs. And then Eric will be our last presenter discussing the cost of growth, the Calgary experience. We'll have about 25 minutes at the end of the session for questions, and potentially some time for questions in between each of the presenters as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it back to Darby to start the session with our first poll.
Thanks very much, Amy. And I would just like to say that there is a change to the agenda, and that we will be hearing just a bit longer from Brian and just a little bit shorter from Pat. So that wasn't reflected in the agenda. But yeah, the poll question and graphics for us. So right now, if I could ask the audience to actually indicate which is the most appropriate for you here. So please answer this. What is your role in your organization or community? So please click on right on the slide that's in front of you, click on the color that's appropriate for you. Planner, engineer, economic development officer, CEO, CFO, consultant, or other. And once we get to a place, I'll be sure to show the results here. There, you should be able to see the results now, and we'll just take down a quick tally of that. Great. Thanks very much. Still a little bit of movement there. And just one last thing I will ask is, please, if all of you could, if you have not done so already, please mute your line, *6. And now I'll be hearing from Brian.
Thank you, Amy and Darby, for this opportunity. As we all know, communities in BC face various infrastructure challenges, and as well, I guess the province has an interest here as we provided or work with infrastructure funding programs from time to time, and that's sort of where my background comes from in this context. We do recognize that these challenges need a long-term approach to ensure community sustainability. The foundation of solid infrastructure is key for communities to deliver the services they need to their residents and also provide for the basis for economic development throughout their community. Of course, currently, over the years, we've been hearing lots in the media and amongst colleagues about the infrastructure deficit and The Federation of Canadian Municipalities in 2007 provided an estimate that nationally is about $123 billion. This number can vary greatly depending on a number of factors, and it's not so important what the number is, but knowing that we've got aging infrastructure and there's going to be a cost associated to renew and replace that. And of course, as infrastructure ages, our renewal and replacement costs increase, and aging infrastructure also can lead to a decrease in level of service. So it's probably no surprise to everybody on here, but local governments are responsible for a diverse number of services. As you can see in the picture, we've got a variety of infrastructure here, giving a swath of what local governments provide in everything from roads and parks, buildings, recreation, transit, as well as all the hidden services underground, the pipes for the water, wastewater, and stormwater, in some cases energy. As such, local governments own and operate a significant amount of capital assets. And the level of service provided by these assets can vary greatly. You see we've got pictures of 3 roads here providing a sort of an obvious distinction between the level of service and also maybe a reflection of some aging infrastructure. In the middle we have a road in good condition providing a reasonably high level of service. And as you move to the slide, the picture to the right, you can see the road bed, the surface of the road starting to break up. Some degradation happening here of either a paved or perhaps a chip seal road. And finally we have a gravel road on the left, which in the wet season is obviously developing a number of potholes that you can see in the picture. The level of service can be driven by and determined by, in some cases, local government and the community, certainly in some cases local roads, whether a gravel road is sufficient for the area or you need a fully paved road with curb and gutter. Or in this case, you've got an example here of a paved road with a ditch for your drainage. In other cases, the level of service is not entirely determined by the community, but is determined by regulation. A quick example would be what sort of water treatment is required for your water source. Of course, there's a cost to the level of service, and it's not just reflected in the capital cost of the infrastructure. There's the other costs that need to be considered beyond the capital cost. The long-term costs, the operation, the maintenance, which include the repairs, the renewals, and the eventual disposal of an asset, can take up to 75 to 80% of your life cycle cost of that infrastructure. The capital cost, the 20 to 25%, is the number that is often more prevalently dealt with. It's what we see with the grant funding programs. It's what we see in the media. But it's important that decision makers are basing their decisions on the full life cycle cost of the infrastructure. Can they afford to own and operate and maintain that infrastructure over the lifespan of it, as opposed to just can you get the money together to provide capital to build it in the first place.
Okay, I think we have a full question for you. So if again I could ask the audience to please indicate this next question. Brian, is this the question you wanted at this point?
It's not, but
it's all right. We may be moving to.
Sure, that's it.
Here we are. Sorry. Great. So again, that question: are the elected officials and community members aware of the resources required to continue to meet the current level of service? So, like previously, if you could just indicate what's appropriate for you. And I'll show you the results again. Still a bit of movement there.
Oh, we're in the back. They were trying to be radical.
We are getting a bit of feedback on the line. So again, if I could remind people to please mute their line. *6, please. Thank you. And take a tally of that. Okay, good to go.
We had, what was the yes percentage? 6% yes. So that leaves us with 94, 93% in the no and unsure category. It's a fairly high percentage. Hopefully over time we can shift that, and certainly as we get further into the discussion of asset management, we'll talk more about community engagement. But to start, a lot of this asset management work that we're going to talk about in BC really got the lift when local governments had to deal with the Public Sector Accounting Board Regulation 3150. Local governments are required to do this under Section 167, subsection 2 of the Community Charter. Financial statements must meet the generally accepted accounting principles for local governments. And they were required to, for the first time, document exactly what they own and historical costs, as well as the condition of the infrastructure. This obviously involved a lot of work, especially on the financial end, some provided by the engineering side. It does provide an overview of the value of the infrastructure that local governments own, and it provides a lot of baseline data that can be used to or that can be leveraged into an asset management plan or procedures within an organization. So it provides some of the baseline that's required and gets people going. And in this case, this is regulated, whereas asset management is not. So it sort of provides that stepping stone, as well as for some, and feedback we received here was an eye opener to some as to actually what value and the actual diversity and value of infrastructure owned by their local government when it was all kind of rolled up together for the first time. What is asset management? Well, the integrated approach involving planning, engineering, and finance, as well as public works, effectively manage existing and new municipal infrastructure in a sustainable manner to maximize benefits, reduce risks, and provide satisfactory level of service to the community user in an environmentally and ecologically responsible manner. And really the key here is the integration between the different disciplines, between the planners, the engineers, finance, and operations, public works, to provide that service that the infrastructure is there for within the community. Getting them all speaking the same language and working together can help further the asset management. Certainly, when the second and third part of the presentation come with Pat and Eric's portion, they'll highlight sort of the key influence that planners have and the effect on infrastructure and costs.
Okay, I have another poll question. And was it the previous one there? Yeah. So again, we're trying to keep you engaged here. So do you see a role for asset management practices in your organization? So again, if you could please vote for what's appropriate for you again. Yes, no, or not sure. Show the results. Results are a little leaner than before. Definitely a clear indication.
Yes. Yeah, very clear indication that 100% versus the previous one, that asset management practices have a role, and obviously probably a lot of you may already be doing various portions of it. So yeah, but much more positive result than the previous one. And I think that previous one probably is one that follows as communities engage further in asset management. It starts engaging the community and providing more of a dialogue. So some of the benefits of asset management helps in avoiding problems and potential crises. It assists with the long-term financial planning. It aims to provide a better and consistent level of service to the public at less cost. Keeps a happier community, as well as a safer and healthier community, as well as one where we can better for investment. And overall reduces the risk to community. Another component in there is it helps develop appropriate rate structures for services that are fee-based. It helps include costs for the overall wear and tear on the assets or the average annual asset consumption, so that you can recoup the costs that are required in the future to pay for the replacement. So the people that are actually using the asset are also paying for the replacement rather than pushing that off onto future generations, which is partly what has happened with the current quote-unquote infrastructure deficit that was mentioned at the front. Those replacement costs weren't accounted for, and as the infrastructure has deteriorated, those costs have been pushed forward onto future generations that need to pay to upgrade those deteriorating infrastructure. So it's much more provides a much more forward-thinking and proactive approach to managing infrastructure in your communities. It leads to more effective communication with the ratepayers. Certainly when you're discussing appropriate rate structures, you're going to have to involve those ratepayers and they get to understand the actual costs of delivering that service as opposed to just some that are subsidized or hidden costs, puts it right out on the table. Elected officials and regulatory agencies as well. When you're dealing with your actual costs, it of course allows for more accurate financial planning. When you're dealing with looking long-term, you can also predict when you're going to need some of the big replacements, again, helping with that financial planning. Leads to more efficient data management and results in positive institutional change. It also probably requires some institutional change in some cases, engaging the different departments to work together, where traditionally our departmental structure, both here at the province and at local governments, often keep people working within their own department, their own walls, and in their own silo. And as well, again, as mentioned, engages the community. An anecdotal example, I was discussing with a mayor from a community in BC who's their community's gone down the path of asset management. They've got a long-term 20, 25-year asset management plan in place. They've identified when they intend to replace different infrastructure, when they intend to upgrade it, what the condition is and the life are of their various pieces. And he feels very comfortable now when community members come to him or her and say, when is this going to be done in my neighborhood or my portion of the community? When is this change going to happen, or when is this piece of infrastructure going to be improved or replaced? He now feels very confident responding to them and saying, it's going to be done at this point. He can tell them when it's planned to be done in the future. He can tell them also why that decision was made to prioritize it at that point, and he can provide the logic behind that decision-making, all through the asset management work they've done. So in the end, it's been a lot of work, it's relief from this conversation, but he also meant something they couldn't do alone, and they have reached out for support, and one place where they've gotten support is through Asset Management BC, which is a group that has a steering committee, but it's here for the local governments throughout the province. There is no membership, there's no formal association, everybody can be a part of it. The steering group itself was developed from the bottom up. There's a number of local governments at the table, sort of 8 to 12 at any given time, representing different sizes and regions of the province. They have the various professional associations that have a role in asset management at the table. The Engineers Association, the Local Government Managers Association, the Planners Association, as well as Public Works. There's also UBCM is at the table. There's an education component through BCIT, who has an infrastructure management program, as well as we have representatives from the province and the federal government, all working together and essentially developing a network to facilitate knowledge transfer and capacity building on asset management throughout the province.
Okay, and we do have another poll question here. Yeah, I hope you're all able to see this poll question. The question is, are the infrastructure issues dealt with in an interdisciplinary setting or by an interdisciplinary team in your organization? So please, again, the audience, you could indicate what's appropriate for you, yes, no, or not sure, and we'll show you the results shortly. And I'll just take this moment just to ask, once again, if any of the attendees has not yet had an opportunity to press mute, please do so. We are still getting just a bit of feedback, so please hit *6 to mute your line if you haven't done so already. I'll show you the results of where we're at right now. You're able to now see the results. We got a tally there. All right. So we have close to 50-50. It was fluctuating before we showed you. It was sort of hovering at 50-50 in this. Well, now we're at 47-52, which is a good sign. We can go to the next slide. We, in one of the first pieces of work that Asset Management BC did was to get an assessment of what's going on in the province. And they did a study titled The State of Asset Management in BC. It was released in September 2010. The process was, the results were gathered through interviewing 39 local governments spread throughout the province, again, various sizes, and getting a geographic representation from west and north to south. Certainly one of the outcomes of this identified was integration of staff and departments on the asset management front is a requirement. And this is information coming from the local governments, not from the group. And seeing that we're polling here at close to 50-50, compared to what we were getting in this study, we're showing an increase already, which is certainly a good sign. A couple other issues that were identified through this that
there's information available to get started. The information, depending on where the local government's at, might not be perfect, but that's not necessary. It's just the fact that the information is baseline information available, and the people have the ability to get started. One concern that was raised across the board by many was that capacity to implement asset management was or could be an issue. One way some local governments have gotten around this is rather than identifying individual as an asset manager, they've built in asset management into individual job descriptions in the different departments to bring people together. A real driver behind doing this document was to help guide Asset Management BC in moving forward and identifying what might be useful to develop as ways of tools and resources to supply across the province. One of the tools that's come out of this is an asset management self-assessment tool titled Asset Smart. It's a paper-based tool. It can be downloaded and can be done by any local government. It's a series of questions that lead you through, or discussion points and questions that lead you through to identify what asset management strengths and capacities you already have within your community, what you're doing well, and where you might have some gaps that need to be addressed. So it's a self-identification process. There are resources to support it if needed, as far as a number of communities have undertaken using this tool, and the feedback so far has been positive. And certainly, if you do use it, feedback is always welcome to always improve the tool and share that with the community as a whole. Further to the Asset Smart tool, it was identified that if we've identified what we're doing well and what we might need to do and where our gaps are, where do we find that information? And that was sort of the next project for 4 communities collaborated on. Lake Country, Powell River, Tofino, and Merritt got together, worked together in conjunction with Asset Management BC and a consultant to develop an asset management roadmap that is on one hand generic because it can be applied to any local government in the province, but it's also in a sense fully customizable. And this is the handout that's been supplied through this presentation, so you can download it and see the full picture here. I just on the slide just have a snapshot of the top quarter or third, which identifies sort of the basic boxes as they were called. This document, or this one pager, is backed up with sort of a guidebook on how to implement. So each one of those boxes that you see up there, which is sort of a key step or one of many steps in sort of the asset management map, has a subsequent information sheet that goes with it on as to the sort of what that does for you, what's behind it, the details, and where the information comes from and what the information feeds into. The local governments that have piloted this have found that, right off the bat, they're able to tick off quite a number of the pink boxes saying, we're already doing this, and in some cases, not necessarily in a formalized fashion or under the umbrella of asset management. They realize that the information is there or that procedure is already there and it can be pulled in. And a few have used the Asset Smart tool and then followed up by then using the Asset Management Roadmap to sort of start filling in the gaps. Of course, this roadmap was just officially released in September 2011, so just within the last month, and is, again, open for feedback. And the full document beyond what you have in front of you, as well as some of the supporting case studies that went with it, are available for download online. Finally, a few other tools and resources. One of the boxes in the Asset Management Roadmap identifies that having an asset management policy for the organization is a useful tool to give direction and guidance to staff on going forward with asset management practices. Some of the feedback we got from local governments as well, we don't have the time to develop a policy, so a draft or a model policy was developed with a bit of a guide that can be taken and tweaked to fit individual organizations. We've had a few communities that use this model to adopt a policy in their community, and it helps them, again, tick off one of those asset management roadmap boxes if necessary. Furthermore, they've been working with local governments in the province, about 6 at this time on 2 different pilot projects. One testing an asset management developed through what was at the time Northern Affairs Canada.
All right, getting feedback this time, so if you could, please hit *6 to mute your line. That seems to resolve the issue. Sorry, Brian.
That's all right. Further to that, we've also had a recent pilot, which is not complete yet, using the NAMS system from Australia. Australia's been doing asset management for 15 plus years, and it's developed quite a easy to use and robust system for developing your long-term asset management plans and identifying your priorities on replacements. The results of these pilots the intention is to share these with local governments sort of through the Asset Management BC forum, as well as directly from the local governments that participated in it with any local government that's interested in finding out more on how it was applied. Again, the results aren't available quite yet at this time because they're still going through the process, but the update on that will be available probably by the beginning of the new year. As well on the website, there's a few other things available that can help. There's a regular newsletter, there's case studies, there's a discussion forum where questions can be asked and answered, and results or presentations and such from workshops, as well as announcements for workshops and that. And the website's there on the slide for you. Input is always welcome, and the organization's always looking to find what the next sort of resource that might be required and help support the development of that within the province. And again, it's been province specific, but it's been the group also networks with groups across the country. Finally, I guess from the ministry's perspective, the province is committed to helping local governments meet the needs of communities and doing that in various ways to help with the development of sustainable infrastructure. Asset management is one piece of the puzzle. Certainly we see that as a key piece in sort of the long-term sustainability of local government infrastructure and the service that it provides. There's other future considerations, of course, to keep in mind as you move forward with your infrastructure planning. There's climate change adaptation, which is always something to consider. Changing in demographics as our population ages. Of course, there's also a rise in expectation in service levels. But all these things can start being kind of rolled into sort of long-term asset management infrastructure planning as you move forward. And the key is not getting to the end result right away. It's just getting started. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. We did try and plan for a bit of time for questions, but we are running just a little bit behind. So what I would ask is if you do have a question anytime, there's that Q&A button at the top on your header. You can put questions in there at any time, and we will have time for discussion at the end. So if you do have some questions, just ask you to perhaps hold off at this point, and we'll move to the next presentation, which is Pat. And here is Pat. There she is. Pat, if you could hit *6 to unmute your line, and away you go.
Okay. Just waiting for the presentation to come up.
It's there. You should be able to advance along the slides with those arrows in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen.
Okay, great. Thanks, Darby.
Thanks, Pat.
Well, hello, everyone. My name's Pat Gordon. I'm the director of International Network of Cities that exchange experiences and learnings around being more sustainable. And I'm sort of the bridge between these two presentations, or a nice way to look at it might be the best part of the sandwich here, I hope. I'm going to tell you a little bit about ourselves around sustainable cities. So you're probably wondering sort of what the link is or what the connection is. But really, one of the connections is myself. I was the project manager of the work that Eric is going to be talking about in the next presentation. And that was when I was working in Calgary, where I was employed for over 9 years. The next thing is that Calgary is actually a member of this international network. So this kind of practice that we're talking about here, this infrastructure costing study, is the kind of information that we share between ourselves. And we are mostly cities and towns, and have quite a wide range of a wide range of participants from around the world. So our mission, I'll just briefly tell you about us. Our mission is to catalyze action on urban sustainability in cities around the world. Sorry, I'm getting the hang of this here. Why cities? As you probably, if anyone's been reading the papers lately, as we now know that we've passed the point that the majority of the world's population live in cities. Now, I know that a lot of the BC communities are more sort of rural focused, but inevitably municipalities are often built up, or the rural area is always related to a city, or has some sort of relationship with the city. So certainly in terms of our membership, we've got regions from around the world that include rural areas as well as the urban core. So that's just a map of some of the cities and regions that are members of our network. When we talk about sustainability and urban sustainability, this is the way that we try to present it. It's the idea that the whole is stronger than the sum of its parts. We're not just talking about the environment or the economy or society. Any of our projects and any of our work really try to focus on ways to build those three elements into a stronger place. Now, the infrastructure problem, Brian mentioned at the start with a number of 123 million. I've got an even scarier number here from the Municipal World, a chap who'd written a recent study, now equates it between 125 and 300 billion. And that excludes the 300 billion estimated required to upgrade the electrical system. So more and more municipalities are engaging, around their energy and how they're supplying energy to their citizens. And so either way, I think, as Brian said, that's a big number, and it's a number we should all be thinking about. Now, this work that Eric will talk about in a minute, and I'm just going to try and put it into context and into place, is that it's part of the solution. So the work that Brian talked about managing and understanding your assets, what they're costing you, where you should be saving more money to update them in the future, that sort of thing. This is another angle to that same argument. So it's just part of the solution. So I really want to try and show you where it fits in the overall kind of planning and thinking processes that we do within municipalities. So some of you may be familiar with this. I know we've got a mix of engineers and planners and other folks on here. The ICSP, the Integrated Community Sustainability Plan, is usually sort of the strategic undertaking that lots of municipalities do at the top there. They then do their OCP, or in Calgary's case, an MDP, which is tends to be mostly the land use planning component, but can also hold other pieces, but it's often the statutory document of the municipality. And then under that, they do a whole bunch of functional, what I'll call functional plans, for want of a better word. That includes asset management plans, transportation plans, affordable housing plans, community energy and environment plans, you name it. No shortage of planning in local government. One of the things we got to very early on in our Calgary experience was that you can't plan transportation free of land use. So I'm going to make this first statement here, is that really you've got to bring the transportation piece up into the dialogue, or up into the sort of core of the transportation and land use planning within the OCP and the MDP piece, because they're two sides of the coin. We build roads, it fills up with different kinds of land use. We agree land use, and then we start putting roads out to them. So it's not an either or, and you'll find experts in both fields telling you that it's, the transportation guys will say, no, we follow the land use, and the land use guys will say, well, actually, we're having to follow the transportation because the road's already there. So it's a bit of a sticky wicket, but one that really has to be tackled together. So that's that one piece. Now, the work that we did in Calgary, and that Eric will tell you in greater detail, should happen before you think about asset management. And I'm not saying that you, and I mean that sort of conceptually, because what we're after here is talking about when you're growing, where you're growing, when you're growing, and how you're growing. So the key place for this kind of study is when you're making those kind of decisions. So for Calgary, that really, they do have a growth management process, but it really was within their municipal development plan. For other places, it may be within their regional growth strategies. But these kind of costing studies are really focused, excuse me, I've got a cold. These costing studies are really focused on the avoidance of spending in the first place. It's kind of a difficult thing to get our heads around sometimes, and particularly Eric will get into this in more detail, but if you think of capital being one part of your budget and operating being another part, capital often comes from other orders of government or other sources. Sometimes it's easier to round up capital and then have to deal with the operating when it comes along. But what we're talking about here is trying to avoid those costs in the first place. So I apologize to anyone if this seems simplistic, but just as an environmental scientist, and I was running these 2 planning initiatives in Calgary, I had to figure a lot of this out the hard way. So I've reduced some what I think are sort of complex notions down into some simple ideas. So you've got a choice when you're growing as a community. You got, for instance, say you're a community of 300 people, and you know you're going to have 3 new families come into your community over the year. So you've got a choice of putting those 3 new houses along 1 new road, building 1 new kilometer of road for those 3 houses. Or you go back into your existing stock of roads and try to find a place for those 3 houses there. So what you've done with this is you've avoided the need to build that first road, and then you've also spread the cost of maintaining that existing piece of road over a lot greater number of people. So what it boils down to, and Erica will touch on this as well, is the tax dollar. If you want to make an argument for growing, for less sprawl, for more smart growth, this is it. Because it all comes down to the tax dollar. There's all sorts of environmental benefits, social benefits, everything else, but when it comes down to the dollar, that's a fairly loud and a fairly clear voice. So Eric will speak to that one as well. So we really are talking about avoidance. And in the lower part of this picture, we're also talking just about more users per unit of infrastructure. So it is avoidance, but it's also sort of efficiency. And my last slide, I just tell you a little bit about what we're doing is we're trying to develop a guide on how to do this. We've had a lot of people express interest in how they would undertake this kind of study. Now, CMHC has a guide that works at the suburb level only, where you're comparing whether you're building in new suburbs or building in sort of infill and regrowth in existing parts of the city. So we're doing a guide like this, but we're looking to do it as a city-wide tool, so a guide and a tool, and make that available to municipalities. So that's me, and I will pass it over, thank you very much, back to Darby, and that's my piece.
Thanks very much, Pat. And Pat, actually, I'll ask you right now to turn off your camera, and I'm going to do the same. And the reason we're doing that, our attendees, the reason we're doing that is just that Eric doesn't have a camera, so as not to distract you, we're going to turn off our cameras, and there'll be no video there. But yes, I'd like to turn things over to Eric, and again, before we do that, I'd like to invite you at any time to put in questions into the Q&A box, and we will be having a discussion period towards the end. So, Eric, please, take it away.
All right, thanks, Darby. I hope everyone can hear me. Again, I apologize for not having a webcam. I was saying to Darby that in some ways we're fairly advanced in the city, but communication technologies were a little behind the times. Hopefully the slides themselves are fairly interesting for you, though. Oh, looks like we've got a quick poll here. Darby, if that's yours.
Sounds right. Indeed. Is this, I'm sorry, Eric, if we do have things out of order, is this a question that speaks to one of your questions?
It's a great place to start.
Okay, great. So how about we do this? Does your community have a long-range land use and or infrastructure plan? So again, audience, if you could please put in what's appropriate for you. And I will show you the results as they develop here. Great. You should be able to see the results now.
So generally, for the most part, yes, which is a good place to start, as you'll see as we start getting into the presentation here. Give us another minute.
Great. Seems like we've kind of got to a point there, so we'll take a tally of that. And great. Thanks, Eric. Sorry to surprise you with that.
No problem. There we go. All right. So there's a nice picture of Calgary for everyone. You can see the Rocky Mountains in the background there. So again, yeah, my name is Eric Mcnaughton. I am the Acting Manager for Transportation Strategy, and happy to give you this presentation today. What I'm going to do is I'll go through quickly talking about what Planet Calgary is, but in the interest of time, I'll go through this first set of slides fairly quickly so I can spend a bit more time talking about the actual costing study that we did that Pat gave a great lead-in for. And so as Pat had indicated, Planet Calgary was really a process that we went through over about 3 years to develop our new municipal development plan, our statutory land use plan, and the Calgary Transportation Plan. That's the part that I was leading. And the two of them were developed in concert the entire way through, even though that they're two separate documents at the end of the day. And those are both based on, I guess this would be our equivalent of the ICSP, the strategic plan. This Imagine Calgary, another project that Pat led, was actually a 100-year vision for the city of Calgary. Looked at more than just transportation, though. It was also looking at a lot of the social, economic, environmental benefits and changes that Calgarians wanted to see in the city, and also sort of local government. Covered quite a range of things. So the Planet Calgary was really taking the physical aspects of Imagine Calgary and landing them on the ground in the MDP and CTP. So there's a number of reasons why we went to update our land use and transportation plans. The first one, probably one of the biggest, which Brian mentioned as well, was the demographic shifts. And it was interesting, we actually had a demographer come in right at the start of our project, and he was looking at both, just for the Calgary region, but also Canada as a whole, is a significant increase in the aging baby boomer population. And you can see this number here, which is really quite shocking. We're looking at a 1,333% increase in people 85 and over the next 60 years. And also that any growth in Calgary and Canada is really going to be reliant on international immigration in about 20 years, because naturally we don't have enough births in the population for native population to grow. So you can imagine with these changes that's going to have some pretty big implications in the way that we live and travel in cities and smaller communities. Also, particularly in Calgary's case, we've got a lot of emerging pressures from constant growth. One of our distinctions is having the largest per capita footprint in Canada. And you can see this table here that energy consumption makes up 56% of our footprint. But what's interesting is if you look at the middle three columns in the table, we've got shelter, mobility, goods and services. All three of those are directly related to the urban form of your community. And so going in with the upfront planning in terms of, so what do we want our community to look like and how do we want it to function is really crucial in terms of changing this pattern. Also, we've got, as has been mentioned multiple times already today, we're really seeing unsustainable growth in our municipal spending. We've improved slightly just from some recent agreements, but generally speaking, we've been recovering less than 50% of the costs for new greenfields, suburban developments, in the past. I think we're probably just slightly over 50% now. Our share of that national infrastructure gap is estimated to be about $3.4 billion for just capital infrastructure right now, and I think that's probably conservative. And we also identified another $3.2 billion in terms of a maintenance gap. And it's fair to say, although we're improving, that there's really been little planning for true life cycle replacement in the past. There's been a lot of work over the last few years. But even at this point in time, for transportation, our capital budget, only about 4 or 5% of it's allocated to life cycle replacement. Oops, wrong button there. So basically for Planet Calgary, what we were looking at was where are the next 1.3 million Calgarians going to live? And we got that number based on looking at growth projections out 60 years. And that probably seems like quite a long ways out. But part of what we wanted to look at was what would change look like? What would different look like for Calgary? And if you were only to do a plan that was going out 20 or even 30 years, there's only so much that can change. So we went out actually a full 2 generations and said, okay, so what would Calgary look like if it was truly different? And with these 1.3 million people, we had to figure out, so where are they going to work, how are they going to travel, and what are the implications of those choices? So I won't go through these in detail, but we developed quite early on 11 sustainability principles, and they're based very closely on smart growth principles, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We also did a variety of research. We had the demographic study. We also looked at housing affordability, the implications of transportation on health, building green infrastructure into our mobility systems, energy mapping, which is a piece that was introduced about halfway through the process. We also did stakeholder engagement with about 6,000 citizens over the course of the project. And all that led to this lovely slide here, which probably looks really complicated, but I'll just try to explain how we did our planning. And this becomes an important piece for doing the costing study that I'll talk about in a minute. So what we've got on the left-hand side of the screen here, as you can see, is we actually worked with a group from the University of British Columbia, one of their urban design groups. And they did some work for us looking at things from the bottom up, because usually when we do city or regional planning, it's usually from the top down, like we would call it the 40,000-foot level. But what they did is they actually kind of came at the bottom up and said, okay, so what kind of different types of communities or developments can you create if you just start looking at the scale of individual buildings, individual streets, the open spaces, and how can you assemble them differently? It was interesting to realize the limited number of patterns of development Calgary had. And we blended that with sort of the more traditional approach you can see sort of in the top middle of the screen there, sort of the citywide views of Calgary. Where would the major pieces of land use fall as the city evolves over time? And you can see that there's 3 of those there. We actually developed several different scenarios. And those were informed partly just by the work from UBC, but also partly from all that research I talked about on the last slide. And maybe one of the things that's important to mention here, because I know that there's a lot of different scales of sort of municipalities and governments listening to this presentation, is the important thing when we start getting into how you compare the implications of different forms of growth, not that you necessarily have all of the specific pieces of research that I'm talking about here, but what you really need is to be able to create a set of scenarios, even just 2 scenarios, that are really spatially defined. And so that's really getting into, so where are people living, where are they going to work, and what are the major pieces of infrastructure? I mean, you might only be focusing on roads and water and wastewater systems, but as long as you can actually physically lay those out, you can work with the same process that we did in Calgary to really try and quantify the benefits of looking at a different type of growth in your community. So here's just a visual example of what we were looking at in terms of redevelopment in some of the parts of Calgary. So just add a little visual splash in color. So you can see, really, again, too, this is where it starts tying into that the investments that we make as a community into our infrastructure can really have an impact on market interest to come in and start redeveloping parts of the city as opposed to constantly looking at suburban growth. And so this would be where we would go in, upgrade a street, introduce new transit services, and over time, could be a long period of time, you start seeing this sort of scale of development. You see even getting more upgraded transit vehicles here, and eventually moving to something radically different from what you started with. So here's the 2 scenarios that we looked at in Calgary for our costing study. The one on the left is what we call our business as usual scenario, and if you look, the areas in sort of gray are Calgary's physical footprint today. The beige areas are how much Calgary would grow if we just kind of continued with mostly or almost entirely suburban development over the next 60 years. And it's interesting, I mean, we're already getting close to being the size of 5 boroughs in New York City, and we only have 1 million people right now. So we're not the most efficient landform at the moment. The recommended direction on the right, which is pretty close to what our final plan came out to be, really does have some suburban development, but probably only about half the amount shown in the dispersed scenario. So between the 2 of them, we actually save about 250 square kilometers, or as one of my boss likes to say, it's about the equivalent of 4 cities of Red Deer, if you're familiar with Red Deer. It's a city of about 70,000 people in the middle of Alberta. So that's a pretty substantial difference in terms of the amount of infrastructure that you would therefore need to actually service the growth in your population. Both these scenarios have the same population, the same amount of employment. It's just distributed quite differently. The recommended direction has a lot more what we call nodes and corridors, so areas of redevelopment like the previous slide I was showing you, that actually are better able to use underutilized infrastructure within the city already. So jump onto the next slide here. Oh, actually, sorry, forgot about this bit. The other thing that's important too is, again, given this is both the land use and transportation study that we did, those arrows that just spread out on the left, that's our either existing or proposed light rail transit system. You can see very radial in and out of the downtown, because there's really only one major destination in Calgary, is the downtown core and a lot of east side industrial with no real transit service. Our recommended direction, because we're actually creating multiple nodes of activity in the city, you can see we've got those same LRT lines, but they're all shorter, which is significant because it's very expensive, obviously, to build rail systems. We're also looking at introducing these crosstown connections. So this is really interesting from a transportation perspective, because we can start connecting multiple destinations that don't exist in the business as usual scenario, and that really creates the opportunity to reduce the amount of automobile use in the city and start focusing more on walking, cycling, and from this image in particular, transit. And that, again, has pretty significant infrastructure implications. So, sorry, it looks like this the text isn't showing up really well on this slide. Again, I'm not going to go through these point by point. You can download the PDF to have a look. But what we did after we went through all the work of developing these scenarios is we came up with 8 key directions, which really were sort of the 8 key points we had to focus on. And it was very much about linking the land use with the transportation investment decisions. The last of the 8 points actually says optimizing infrastructure. So if we jump ahead here, what it means to us when we say optimize infrastructure is that in our MDP now we actually say that municipal financial sustainability actually has to be a consideration for all new growth decisions, and that we should be prioritizing redevelopment or current greenfield activity over new suburban development, which is a complete reversal over what we've done in the past. And again, a very important part of that is focusing our transportation and overall all of our infrastructure investments to support the development of these, what we call activity centers, these mini downtowns, and the corridors. And so this is where we can get into the real meat of the presentation, is the cost of growth study. And you can also download a copy of this off the Planet Calgary website, which I've got a link to at the end of the presentation here. So the benefits for us, as Pat has already alluded to in doing cost of growth studies, is several things. Is that this is really about understanding the fiscal implications of different growth decisions. And, I mean, Calgary is a really business-oriented city, but I think across Canada, what we've noticed is that sometimes it's really hard to get traction. If you want to talk about sustainability, we'll often talk about environmental impacts, social impacts, which some people feel very strongly about, but a lot of people don't connect with the same way. However, what we found when we started talking about the money is that citizens and councils, they can all relate to us, because this is, every growth decision is about costs that are paid through taxes, utility rates, or even embedded in the cost of a new home. So it's all directly hitting the pocketbook of the citizens. Another good thing in terms of the costing study we did is, even if you don't have perfect estimates for each piece of infrastructure, because you're just comparing 2 scenarios which use the same assumptions, it's all right, because you're just looking for the cost differential. But I wouldn't use a study like this for actually doing your budgeting. And the other thing that we found is that going through this process really built up the capacity within our corporation to understand a lot of the implications of our infrastructure decisions. We did have IBI help us pull this study together, but really a lot of the work came internally from the staff. So here's the summary that we found in terms of going through and comparing those 2 scenarios. This is for the capital infrastructure costs. And you can see here what we found is that we've got a few different categories. We looked at our roads, our transits, water, wastewater, fire and police stations, recreation, and schools. And what we came up with is a 33% cost avoidance, as Pat said, if you went with the recommended direction as opposed to continuing along with the business as usual. Now, same time, to be fair, is that, jump ahead there, but that both these scenarios are going to cost money. Growth costs money no matter what you do. But at the same time, what we found across the board was that going with a more compact type of growth and making better use of existing infrastructure was going to save us in the order of $11 billion over 60 years, and that's all in about 2007 dollars, so it's quite substantial. And this really ties back to the asset management piece, in that by avoiding having to build the infrastructure to support additional suburban development, we've saved money up front, but that money could also, therefore, like, so if we actually had the $11.2 billion, if need be, that could actually be redirected into actually paying for the asset management life cycle requirements of the aging infrastructure. So it's almost a double benefit, really. Now, the only reason I've got schools blocked off in blue here is that those aren't actually a City of Calgary responsibility. They're managed by the province of Alberta, but again, it's still a citizen cost through tax dollars. So quickly, just showing also, we looked at annual operating costs. This is a little harder to collect, we found. But for the information we were able to gather, again, we found across the board savings between the business as usual form of growth and our recommended direction, and those savings are about 14%. Maybe one point that's important to make here is that Pat showed CMHC has a tool to do analysis of individual suburbs. And we were actually looking at that at first when we started down this path, but we quickly realized a problem with the approach that's taken there is because it's only looking at an individual community, a community that actually was more intense, like had more people living in it, had more jobs in it, might require more infrastructure, more roads, more wastewater, water facilities, all that kind of thing. So on an individual community basis, it might actually look more expensive to build a more intense community. But because it's more intense, it means you're actually building fewer communities. So from a citywide basis, you're actually saving money in the order of magnitude that I'm showing here. And now we're ready for the next poll.
Great, Eric. And here's that poll question. So again, audience, has your community looked at the cost implications of different potential growth patterns? Again, if you could press what's appropriate for your case, and I'll show the results. What we have so far, which is starting to bounce. Proud to say it was holding solid.
So about half are saying no, but 23% are saying yeah. So that's actually pretty good. Because when Pat and I were initially doing some investigation, I think we saw that there were 1 or 2 jurisdictions in Canada that had a look. But that's definitely a positive result, I'd say, and also the groups that plan to as well. Great.
Okay. Well, we got the numbers here, so I'll go back to the slides, Eric.
All right. Thank you.
There's that graphic. There you go. Yep.
Right. So what I'll do quickly here, just to give you a sense of the process that we went through, and again, this is something that I think most any community can replicate, no matter how large or small, as long as you've got 2 scenarios where you have some sense of the infrastructure that's required. So again, they have to be spatial scenarios. But if you've got that, even just pieces of that, you can get to the same kind of result that we did. So the road network, this was the single biggest piece in terms of cost avoidance that we identified through the whole process. What we did is we actually measured say the linear difference, but literally just the length of the roads for both our high capacity, say expressways and arterials, and also the local roads within each community. We had to make some estimates about the width of those roads, but we just based that on some previous analysis that we had done. And that we've, as I said earlier, actual costs for road construction can vary, but again, as long as you use the same assumptions in each of your scenarios, it's right, because again, you're really just focusing on what's your relative difference. And so we found, I think in this case, and I apologize, I think the colors changed in transition here, but the capital savings for roads was about 36%, comparing the recommended direction versus the business as usual scenario, and another 18% savings in operating costs. Now, we actually already got our operating costs from previous work that was undertaken in our asset management program in our roads business unit, so that made life a lot easier. So again, it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. The more asset management information that you've got, even easier it becomes to start estimating, in particular, your operating costs impacts from some of these decisions. Now, transit may or may not be an issue depending on what community you're in, but I would say this was actually the most complicated part of the study for us, because it's not just a simple relationship that you have to just build more transit if you've got more density, because you'll see a little equation I've got here, is that the more density you have, there's a very strong relationship to increasing ridership, because you're putting more and more people within convenient access of transit services, and also then convenient access to destination at the other end. So that actually increases the revenue that you get in your transit system. So we actually had quite a shock when we went through, like, intuitively you can say, okay, if you have a more compact city, most things should be cheaper. But because we were actually relying on putting more transit infrastructure in and better services, we were quite convinced this would actually show up as being more expensive. But when we actually did the analysis, because the LRT lines in the more compact version would be shorter, we actually discovered that we would still see a 9% savings in our infrastructure costs for transit, even though we were going to put in many more roads. And because of the increase in revenue, our operating costs, despite it being a much better transit system, operating costs are exactly the same. And we didn't cook those numbers, trust me. So we did have to bring in some previous analysis, some estimates that we had done about how the transit ridership would change, but there's some research available out there that can help guide you in terms of how transit ridership and auto use change as the density and amenities in your community change. But again, even this was a surprisingly positive finding in our analysis. Water and wastewater, this one, in principle, is pretty straightforward. There's two pieces you need to look at when you're looking at water and wastewater systems. In terms of the actual water and wastewater plants, the number of plants is really constant with population. So there's no difference. If your scenarios have the same population, you're going to have the same number of facilities for all intents and purposes. But there is a big difference, as with roads, in terms of the length of pipe that you have to install. But one of the other interesting things that we found as we were going through the analysis is that when you build a new suburban community at the edge of your city or town, is that you need all the new pipes, obviously, but you almost invariably need to make upgrades to the existing pipes within the older parts of the city. With redevelopment, if you can time it to sort of match up with your life cycle, you actually might have very little impact in terms of costs for having to upgrade the size of your pipes to accommodate redevelopment. And that's just because, most of the cost comes into actually going through the work of digging up the pipe. Putting in a slightly larger pipe when you go in to replace the old pipe, not a big cost implication. So we actually found here, even though it wasn't the largest difference in terms of dollars, there was a little over a 50% potential savings in both capital and operating costs for wastewater if you focused more on a redevelopment approach to building your city as opposed to suburban growth approach. Fire and police services, again, the number of fire stations we found is heavily based on, they determine it based on response time. In Calgary, they're trying to make sure that they always have a fire station within 8 minutes of any home. So the size of your city and the degree of congestion you've got with vehicles really heavily influences the number of fire stations you require. The number of fire engines, however, is really linked very closely to population, so that was the same between the two scenarios. Police services, I'm always kind of assume this probably because they're thinking they've got a lot of vehicles just kind of patrolling. The police service said they're really linked to population and not urban form. But again, here we're looking at almost a 50% savings in capital, another 18% in operating. So it's pretty substantial percentage savings. Fire and police are pretty small in terms of the total dollar value, but it still adds up. Recreation and parks, again, the number of recreation facilities is really closely linked to your urban form. If you're building new suburban communities, you probably need to start building new recreation facilities. But regardless, if you've got existing facilities in the other part of your city, you still have to refurbish them. So you're better off, if you're looking at the redevelopment scenario, to refurbish those older facilities anyways, but actually get better use and more of your population making use of that asset management investment. Parks are really linked to urban density as well, and one of the things we did recognize is that if you're going to do a more compact city, you have to change your perspective a bit about necessarily the size of the open spaces you're trying to provide, but you certainly have opportunities. Operating costs were both linked to usage, which we found wouldn't be that different, but again, we found potential for almost 20% in terms of capital savings costs and 10% in operating savings costs for going with the more compact recommended direction. And again, finally, with schools, as I said, schools aren't a city responsibility here, but at the same time, the number of new schools, as with any other facility, is pretty closely linked to urban density. Again, if you're growing at the edges, you need to provide new school facilities, but you still have to upgrade or get rid of, in some cases, unfortunately, schools in the existing parts of the city. So again, schools, like many of the others, we found potential for about 27% capital cost savings, but really no difference in the operating costs savings for schools, because that's mostly where you have the number of teachers and support staff are tied to the number of students, and that doesn't change between our scenarios. So I know I went through that fairly quickly, but I think we still have some time in the webinar for questions about all these. And again, you can still go to our Planet website, and on the left-hand side you'll see a link to our research, which includes the cost implication study that's been talking about here. And that's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Eric. And indeed, we do have some time here for questions. So, sure, if anything was run over quickly, we can speak to it now. So what I'd like to do is actually point our attendees back to the feedback button on the top right-hand corner of the of the screen. If you, so way up here, but further up into the corner, that header, if you do have a question now, and we certainly encourage them, if you could just change that indicator from green to proceed to purple, which is question. So in a sense, you're raising your virtual hand, and then I'll just call on you, and you can unmute your line and ask your question. If you don't want to do it out loud, you can also use the Q&A box, which is, again, on the header, the top of your screen, and you can enter any question you like there. We'll address it. But we do have a question here. I think it was pointed towards Brian, and that question was, what community has developed the long-term asset management plan that was mentioned?
In response to your question, Jeff, you can either point to Lake Country or Golden. Both have done a fair bit of work in asset management. There's a few other communities as well, but those two kind of pop to mind first. They're both actively involved in furthering asset management within the community, and also involved with Asset Management BC. So they're happy to share what they've learned at this point.
Great, thanks, Brian. Jeff, and please feel free to just raise your virtual hand there with the feedback indicator if you want to speak to that question any further. But we do have another question from Danielle. Danielle, if you could just please press *6 and unmute your line and ask your question. We heard you for just a moment there, but...
Hi, sorry, that was an accident.
We can hear you now.
Yeah, I'm just curious, I guess this is directed to the fellow from Calgary, but anybody else as well. There's a lot in those scenarios that you compared, and I was just wondering if you're familiar with any other cities that have done similar comparisons.
Well, actually, that one I might pass over to Pat, because Pat was doing some of the initial research about what the other cities in Canada had done. Mm-hmm. Put you on the hook there, Pat.
Pat, we may not be able to hear you.
Yep, thank you.
There you go.
Lots of buttons to press here. Thanks. It's Daniela, is it? Yeah,
it's Danielle and friends. I would be one of those.
Danielle and friends. So when we started off in Calgary, there really wasn't anyone else doing this. I found a similar study for Toronto at that time, and so we ended up sort of doing it ourselves, and that's why Sustainable Cities right now is looking to try and develop a guide for how to do it.
So
I would think that no matter where you're at, if you're just starting an OCP, you should be asking your consultants that are doing your OCPs to provide, at minimum, some spatially developed scenarios, because I know that other cities have got scenarios, but then they can't do the work off of them because they're not spatially structured in the first place. So that would be my sort of key guidance here, but I know there's other big cities in the States have started to do this kind of work as well.
So are you basing your guide on the Calgary scenario, or
no? It would be based. My vision for it is more sort of a generic how-to. First off, is how to build those scenarios in a spatial way that they're of use to you, because you can get far more than just costing data off them. You can get we did all sorts of measures that were like walkability and everything else. So it's quite important to do a spatial piece to your scenarios, and I think what's happening is, as I understand it, is that's just not happening when municipalities are doing their OCPs. So that I would say that if you're about to launch into one, that just ask around of consultants that they can help you with that.
Yeah, that's great. Great work.
Thanks for your question, Danielle. And again, we invite further questions if there are any out there. We did also put up a few discussion questions here on the screen to try and elicit those questions. So what have been your challenges with asset management? we do. We want to hear from you. What have been your successes with asset management? So what are the challenges and opportunities that you've experienced? Does anyone wish to either speak to those or ask any other question? Any comments at all from our participants or presenters as well? We do have a question actually coming through. Paul, if you could hit *6 and ask your question.
Yes, can everyone hear me all right?
Can hear you fine. Please go ahead.
The question is in relation to tourism infrastructure more so. I'm with the Government of Alberta here with the Ministry of Tourism, Parks and Recreation, and we're going through a reorganization and a strategy change. We've been tasked to work closely with our municipal stakeholders. And in that task, again, it's infrastructure and transportation are two key industries at the provincial level that we're making better connections with, but also we need to work at our municipal levels throughout the province at a region-by-region basis. So any advice or strategies from our experts there on how they have incorporated, I guess, the tourism side into the asset management and the infrastructure challenges that they've seen?
Are there particular types of tourism infrastructure you're thinking about?
Well, I mean, they range from, even LRT allows people to go out to different communities for, recreational entertainment opportunities, events, those kind of things. So it's a full range, but some of the assets that I've seen out there are minor in something as small as interpretive planning and signage and those kind of things.
Well, I know in Calgary, going back, if you sort of remember those maps that I was showing earlier, definitely one of the things that we were trying to focus on more was trying to ensure that there was proper transit access to all the major destinations in Calgary, and that would include tourism sites, say, Heritage Park, access to the downtown, sort of in terms of arts and culture facilities and what have you. But it sort of, in our case, was in part built into the larger concept of trying to create these nodes, because one of the things that you need really for reasonably cost-effective transit service is sort of a critical mass of activity, and that's where we always talk about it. It could be people and jobs. It doesn't have to just be residential or just jobs and amenities. It's trying to create some combination of them, but in order to really make the infrastructure sort of cost-effective, it's trying to link those pieces together. So again, if you're looking at any sort of new type of tourism infrastructure, so can it be positioned in such a way that it's easily accessible and adjacent to other types of developments? Because that improves the chances of trying to actually justify the expense of building new pieces of infrastructure to support it. Right. And also, certainly from a transportation point of view, increases the opportunity for just like walking and cycling access.
Yeah, I guess an example here in Edmonton is the Royal Alberta Museum. The new site identified is right in the heart of downtown, very close to the extension of the LRT. So, I mean, it was strategic in that respect. Some people don't agree with that, but from a big infrastructure project, that makes sense, I guess. At the smaller communities, though, the municipalities, I think some more front-end planning needs to be done, both from the provincial to the municipal side of things.
I'd just like to invite Brian or Pat if they have anything additional to add. Brian. Yeah. Thanks for your question, Paul. And again, we invite any additional questions. Dave, please, *6 and...
Hello?
Hi there, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Dave Dyer, City Prince George, and sorry I have a cold today, but our asset manager fellow isn't with me, but I just wanted to comment on two of the questions you have here. Prince George, we've been, I guess some of our successes in the, I guess a number of years ago, probably going back 10 years ago, was developing a pavement condition management system that helped us to rank our roads with respect to surface distress indicators. And over time, this has helped us in presenting to council the infrastructure gap or the funding gap that we've had in maintaining our roads, and have been able to increase our budget internally to emphasize the need for more action. And however, we still fall well short of that, as over the number of years now we've been seeing that even though we've improved on the infrastructure or overlays and maintenance on our roads, we've actually not really improved too much in the actual kilometers or lane kilometers of road overlays as a result of asphalt prices increasing. So it's kind of an interesting, sad sort of situation, but we're continuing to battle potholes, and that's one of our biggest issues in Prince George, and we attribute that to climate change and a few other things. But the success part was the fact that it really got the awareness of council when we were able to demonstrate there was a service level or a surface distress indicator that we could compare our roads with. The challenges I picked up on one of the presentations, I think it was Eric mentioning that difficult to find or get the operation maintenance costs. And that is a challenge when you're looking at asset life expectancy and design life and your investment back into your infrastructure, and getting a condition assessment of your infrastructure, especially if it's buried. When it's a water main, it's in particular difficult to get a condition assessment on your infrastructure. All you can really base it on is age. So that is one of the biggest challenges I think we have as time goes forward in first of all getting council or getting our people that are in decision-making levels to be able to give them the best information on the life of our infrastructure, so we know how much to invest. So that's what our observations are like here in Prince George, anyway.
Thanks for sharing that, Dave. And it's the message about having your asset management, or at least in the specific example you gave of your pavement condition management system, and be able to use it as a communication tool to present to council, is something we've been hearing consistently from local government staff, and that it provides that logic and basis to make the argument as to why this needs funding and how much funding it might need and what that funding will do and how it fits in with the overall priorities. And it certainly provides that more clear engagement with council, and that can roll out to council engaging with citizens in those discussions. Thanks for the example. It's another good one to hear.
Thanks, Brian. Any other comments from the presenters? And we still just have a couple minutes left if there are a few more questions out there.
Hi, I have one question. It's Joan Chess, also in Prince George with Fraser Basin Council.
Hi, Joan. Go ahead.
Hi. I work with small communities, local governments all across central and northern BC, and I'm wondering if you have any case studies of communities that are actually declining in population. I have a real mix of some are growing, some are about the same, and quite a few that have been losing population over the last 12, 15 years. Thanks.
I can't think of a case study off the top of my head that relates specifically to a community with declining population. However, that would be a great one to work on. So if you have a community in mind, you're certainly welcome to get them in touch with Asset Management BC, and we can see what we can pull together.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and just a minute left. Just any last question out there? Okay, thanks very much. We'll just thank you, and also point you to a few resources that are available here. Here's Brian's team, the Ministry of Community Sport and Cultural Development. There's information there with Pat, Sustainable Cities International, and Planet Calgary with Eric. Resources for you there. Of course, you can get to this PowerPoint presentation again through the handout section, and the resources will be available to you. And here are the contacts for each of our presenters today, who have all expressed certainly their willingness to speak to you at any time if you have some questions. So there's some useful links.
So that's the end of our webinar for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We hope that the information that was provided was useful. I think it was a really interesting topic. Thank you, Brian, Pat, and Eric, for your time and for sharing your expertise with all of us. As I mentioned at the top, the session was recorded and it will be posted on the Rural BC website soon. What's the timeline on getting that posted?
Next week, if not the following, for sure.
Okay, so next week or the following, you'll be able to access the recorded version of the session. And I also mentioned that we'd really like to hear your feedback on the session. So you'll be receiving a survey, and I encourage you to provide your comments on the session today, as well as ideas and input for future sessions. We try to keep a running list of potential topics, and we'd welcome your input to that. So thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Pat and Eric. Ryan, really appreciate it.